In a modern-day society, when you think of a fairy tale, what comes to your mind first? A story about a princess who finds true love, or the story about an adventure that focuses on a male protagonist? Odds are you thought of a princess or some other female lead. Why is that? Why has society's modern-day canon become primarily focused on the fairy tales that prescribed lessons to girls and women? Well, where do fairy tales originate from? According to Maddie Crum, an author at the Huffington Post, quote, they were collected by early catalogers, Gimbansky Basil, Charles Perrault, and the Brothers Grimm. Fairy tales were shared orally, and a look at sources cited in the first collection reveals that the tellers of these tales, at least during the Grimm's heyday, were women. End quote. This is important to note because when fairy tales originated, they were for women by women. However, once Grimm popularized their stories, they would twist the morals and lessons. The Brothers Grimm would also alter their stories in strange ways, where they would keep the violence of the stories but remove any information of a woman doing anything unethical. Quote, while violence, no matter how brutal, generally made the cut, the physical truths of womanhood, including pregnancy and premarital sex, did not. End quote. So part of the reason why we as a society turn to these female-focused stories could very well be because these were the stories with the greatest number of lessons that had a main focus. According to Donald Haas, a professor at Wayne State University, quote, gender-based scholarship would have to explore not simply the fairy tale's content, but also the process of canonization and the institutional control of classical fairy tale collection, end quote. Or to put in simpler terms, the focus on genders in fairy tales would also need to focus on why these stories become the canon of modern-day society. One point that he makes is the, quote, significance of romantic fairy tales informing female attitudes towards the self, men, marriage, and society, not simply in childhood, but also in the lives of adult women, end quote. This is important because the lesson of children needing to get married and find love is passed down from generation to generation. When an idea is passed down enough, it becomes something more, where young girls feel they have to get married, so they fall in love, and then they fall in love with these female-focused movies and stories that focus on true love. Then the cycle continues with the next generation that follows. The idea of marriage is further proven when you look at male-focused hero stories, as well as where the princess or heroine of the story is offered as a sort of prize, influenced by Riddle. The hero is rewarded with a girl of some sort, and in a female-focused stories, the princess is rescued by a man. And if we step away from those fairy tales and look at recent history, the idea of a husband, a wife, and 2 kids in one household was idealized. Fairy tales often reflect some aspect of real life. So the idea of a helpless woman is appealing to a man, and the idea of marriage is appealing for a woman. Now, if we primarily focus on the children's fairy tales and their success, you would assume that the pattern would be the same. However, as stated by Ryan Tabert and Kristen Wardski, 2 researchers of children's literature, quote, quite contrary to this assumption, boys' heroes show an astounding amount of empathy and willingness to make sacrifices, and the girls' heroines are open to the world, quick-witted, and uncompromising in defending their claims to happiness. The crucial difference between the two is the means in which the hero and heroine make their way towards happiness. End quote. With fairy tales' appeal to children, the primary focus is not entirely on female-based stories. However, because the stories for females still focuses on finding happiness through a relationship, the idea of a negative role model for female-focused story is still present for these young girls. Even in the popular fairy tale and movie, Frozen, a movie that young girls loved and that claimed to not focus primarily on romance, Anna, one of the main characters, finds love, and that is a part of her happy ending. The end scene does not end with Anna and her sister Elsa, but rather it ends with Kristoff and her fiancé, Kristoff. Frozen is supposed to be considered a progressive modern-day fairy tale, and it actually was successful. However, because it still had the same general aspects of romance and a female focus, it doesn't fall into a category of progressive modern-day fairy tales that I will be covering. So why don't male-focused progressive movies, such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, The Lost City of Atlantis, or Treasure Planet do as well. According to Lisa Rettel, an Austrian historian, quote, "These stereotypes are always presented in the opposing dualities, rich/poor, clever versus stupid, beautiful versus ugly. The fairy tale aims to create a world that is basically good." End quote. So if we look closer at these stories, the idea of a cut and dry moral for any of them doesn't apply. In The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the main character, Quasimodo, is ugly, and therefore shouldn't be good, because beautiful equals good. But he's the hero of the story. In The Lost City of Atlantis, Milo's team ends up not being the heroes in the story, and they all have skewed morals for why they're trying to discover Atlantis. And with Treasure Planet, you have a law-breaking protagonist who shows he can change for the better. These stories don't follow the real-life examples of perfection that most of these fairy tales try to tell. None of these stories have a traditional happy ending or traditional main character, which is why many of their stories are not popularized. Now, if you're the audience, you've probably never heard of any of these stories, and they're told through the corporation Disney, which is known for sharing fairy tales, but because these stories aren't popularized, most people don't know of them since they don't follow the same mold as stereotypical Disney and fairy tale films. So in conclusion, while some of the male-focused fairy tales are popular with children, the stories that are usually portray the females in the story as a victim, and they promote romance as a prize to be won. As a society, we need to do better with allowing progressive fairy tales to become a main focus, so that children of the future don't focus as heavily on female-focused films that only promote romance and weak female leads. Otherwise, fairy tales will just continue to be the same fairy tale with different females as the lead.